In the early hours of the 14th of October 1927, in a shallow limestone valley 6 miles north of Kirkuk, in what was then the British Mandate of Mesopotamia, a drilling crew working for the Turkish Petroleum Company punched through the last few feet of rock at 1,521 feet, and the ground came apart underneath them. The drill string was thrown out of the hole. A column of oil went up past the crown block of the derrick, past 50 feet, past 100, and kept climbing until men standing a mile away could see it against the stars. 2 of the crew on the rig floor died where they stood, killed by the gas that came up ahead of the oil. The well was called Baba Gurgur No. 1, and the name means Father of Fire, because for at least 25 centuries, natural gas had been seeping out of that ridge and burning in the open air. Herodotus knew about those flames. There is a persistent argument among scholars that this is the fiery furnace of the Book of Daniel. And now, into a valley where the ground had been burning continuously since before Rome existed, the company had just released a fountain of crude oil under enormous pressure. It flowed uncontrolled for 8.5 days at roughly 95,000 barrels a day. The men built earth dams by hand to stop it reaching the Kasa River, and then bigger dams behind those, and the town of Kirkuk was partially evacuated because the gas was settling in the streets. By the time it was killed, that single hole in the ground had thrown out something on the order of 800,000 barrels of oil. Here is the number that matters. In the whole of 1927, the entire land surface of the United Kingdom produced less crude oil than Baba Gurgur, No. 1 wasted in a single day. You have probably been told a version of what happened next. It goes like this. After the First World War, tired European diplomats sat down with maps of a collapsed Ottoman Empire, drew straight lines through deserts they had never seen, invented countries that had no business existing and walked away, arrogance, ignorance, a ruler, and a pencil. And the modern Middle East has been paying for their carelessness ever since. That story is not wrong. It is incomplete in the one place where the whole thing is actually decided. Because those lines were not drawn by men who did not care. They were drawn by men who cared enormously, who knew exactly what they were doing, and who were working to satisfy a specific and crushing financial obligation. The borders of Iraq and Kuwait were not an accident of imperial laziness. They were an instrument of debt collection, and the chapter your school textbook left out is the chapter with the loan agreements in it, the concession contracts, the royalty schedules, and the exact sum of money for which one government sold another country's oil. This is the story of how Britain drew a border to trap an oil field, why the state of Kuwait had to be placed on the far side of that border, and how a red pencil used in a tent in December 1922 is still killing people. To understand why Britain behaved the way it did between 1918 and 1928, you have to understand what Britain actually was by then, because it was not what it appeared to be. On the map, it was the largest empire in human history, a quarter of the world's land and a quarter of its people. In the ledgers, it was something much more fragile. Britain did not rule the world primarily through soldiers. It ruled through money. London was the clearinghouse of global trade. Sterling was the currency other countries kept in their vaults. And the city had spent a century lending to everybody from Argentina to Japan. Britain didn't just run an empire of colonies, it ran an empire of credit. The war destroyed that position in 4 years. British national debt in 1914 stood at roughly £650 million, comfortably around a quarter of national income. By 1919, it was about £7.4 billion, somewhere near 135% of everything the country produced in a year. Britain had gone from creditor to debtor in the direction that mattered most, owing the United States something in the region of $4.6 billion. Debt service, meaning simply the interest payments on money already borrowed, was swallowing close to 40% of central government spending by the early 1920s. A concession, in the language of these documents, is a contract in which a government grants a foreign company the exclusive right to search for and take a resource out of its territory for a fixed number of years, in exchange for a payment. Britain now needed concessions the way a man behind on his mortgage needs a second job. There was a second problem, and it was worse. In 1912, the Royal Navy had begun converting from coal to oil because oil-fired ships were faster, needed smaller crews, and could refuel at sea. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, pushed the change through. And in June 1914, the House of Commons voted by 254 to 18 to spend £2.2 million buying a 51% controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. The British state had become an oil shareholder. Then the war proved the point beyond argument. Lorries, tanks, aircraft, submarines, and destroyers all ran on it. Lord Curzon told a dinner in November 1918 that the Allied cause had floated to victory upon a wave of oil. And here's the critical detail that changes everything. Britain had coal in vast quantities and essentially no oil at all. Not in England, not in Scotland, not in any white settler dominion that mattered. American fields were producing something close to 2/3 of the entire world's crude. British-controlled territory accounted for a rounding error, a few percent at best. So the greatest creditor empire in history had just become the greatest debtor in Europe. Its navy now ran on a substance it did not possess, and the money it owed was owed in dollars to the country that controlled the supply. There was one place on earth where that could be fixed. It was a province of a defeated empire. It had oil seeping out of the ground in visible quantities, and in 1918, nobody owned it. The rupture came in 3 parts, and every one of them has a date and a price attached. The first was San Remo, on the Italian Riviera, on the 24th of April, 1920. Britain and France settled the carcass of the Ottoman Empire between them. France abandoned its claim to the Mosul province in northern Iraq, the province with the oil, and took instead a 25% shareholding in the company that would drill there, plus Syria and Lebanon. Britain took the mandate over Mesopotamia. A mandate, in the polite legal fiction of the League of Nations, meant temporary administration of a territory on behalf of the international community until its people were ready to govern themselves. In practice, it meant a colony with better paperwork. The second part was that the Iraqis refused. In the summer of 1920, the country rose in revolt, Shia and Sunni together, from the middle Euphrates to Kurdistan. It took Britain months and the better part of 100,000 troops and levies to crush it. Around 9,000 Iraqis died. Some 500 British and Indian soldiers died. And the bill, which is the part that decided policy, came to roughly £40 million in a single year, at a moment when the Treasury was already borrowing to pay interest on money borrowed to fight a war that had ended 2 years earlier. That number broke the political consensus. Occupying Iraq with an army was unaffordable, and the British press said so daily. So in March 1921, Churchill, now at the Colonial Office, convened the Cairo Conference and adopted 2 solutions. Install a compliant Arab monarch, cheaper than a garrison, and replace the army with the Royal Air Force, which could hold territory by bombing it from above at a fraction of the cost. Iraq's occupation bill fell from over £20 million a year to about £4 million within 6 years. Faisal bin Hussein, the Hashemite prince the French had just thrown out of Damascus, was crowned King of Iraq on the 23rd of August, 1921, following a referendum which reported 96% approval. The third part happened in a tent at Uqair on the Gulf Coast on the 2nd of December, 1922. Sir Percy Cox, the British High Commissioner, spent days failing to get Ibn Saud of Nejd and the Iraqi delegation to agree on a frontier. On the 5th night, according to Harold Dixon, the British political agent who was in the room, Cox lost patience, took the map himself, and took a red pencil and very carefully drew the boundary from the Gulf into the interior. He gave Iraq a large tract Ibn Saud wanted. Then, to compensate Ibn Saud, he took roughly 2/3 of the territory Kuwait had claimed and handed it to Nejd. The ruler of Kuwait was not present. He was informed afterwards. Remember that red pencil. It comes back. The transaction at the center of this entire story was signed in Baghdad on the 14th of March, 1925. The Turkish Petroleum Company, which had never drilled a single well and had never operated in Turkey, obtained from the government of Iraq a concession covering the oil of the Baghdad and Mosul provinces for 75 years. 75 years from 1925 means until the year 2000. The company had the right to select 24 separate plots of 8 square miles each, anywhere in that area, chosen by the company, with the government having no say in which. It would pay Iraq 4 gold shillings for every metric ton of crude it produced. Gold shillings, not paper, so that the payment could not be eroded by inflation, which tells you exactly how carefully the company's lawyers had thought about protecting value and for whom. By 1930, he had signed the Anglo-Iraqi Treaty that traded formal independence for permanent British air bases. In 1932, Iraq entered the League as a sovereign state, and in the spring of 1933, he wrote a private memorandum for his ministers, which has been quoted ever since, in which he said that in Iraq there was still, in his words, no Iraqi people but unimaginable masses of human beings, without a shared national idea. That is, a king describing the country he had spent 12 years failing to assemble. He died in Bern on the 8th of September 1933, aged 50, weeks after the massacre of Assyrian villagers at Simele that his government had failed to prevent. There were rumors of poisoning. No evidence has ever supported them. What the record supports is a man who worked himself into the ground managing a contradiction he had not designed. 5 men settled the rest of the century at Ostend, on the coast of Belgium, on the 31st of July, 1928. Cadman for Anglo-Persian, Deterding for Royal Dutch Shell, Teagle for Standard Oil of New Jersey, representing an American consortium called the Near East Development Corporation, Mercier for the Compagnie Française de Pétrole, a company the French state had created specifically to hold the shares taken from Germany at San Remo, and Gulbenkian, holding nothing but his 5% and the original 1912 architecture, which gave him a veto in practice because the others needed his consent to restructure. The dispute was territorial, and it was not about who owned what. It was about where the signatories agreed not to compete. The instrument they produced is known as the Red Line Agreement, and its operative provision is a self-denying clause, which means a promise by each company that it will not seek oil anywhere inside a defined area except jointly through the shared company with all partners taking their fixed percentage. Inside the line, competition was contractually abolished. The four groups took 23.75% each. Gulbenkian kept his 5%. The line itself was drawn on a map of the former Ottoman Empire. In the account that has been repeated for 90 years, Gulbenkian took a thick red pencil and drew it himself, around the borders of the empire as it had stood in 1914, and when the others questioned the boundary, he told them, that was the Ottoman Empire, which I knew in 1914. A second red pencil on a second map, 6 years after Uqair. Inside the line went Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Transjordan, Iraq, and the whole Arabian Peninsula. 2 territories were deliberately drawn outside it. The first was Persia, because Anglo-Persian already held it alone and had no intention of sharing. The second was Kuwait. And the reason Kuwait was left outside was not sentiment and not geography. It was a document. On the 27th of October 1913, Sheikh Mubarak of Kuwait had signed an undertaking to the British government that he would not grant any oil concession to anyone except a company nominated by Britain. That single page, signed 14 years before anyone found oil in Iraq and 25 years before anyone found it in Kuwait, was the legal hook. Kuwait was already spoken for, which meant Kuwait was the one door in the wall. Here is how that door was opened, step by step, over 11 years. Start with Major Frank Holmes, a New Zealand mining engineer with a walrus mustache and a syndicate in London called Eastern and General. Holmes had been prospecting concessions around the Gulf since 1922, on the unfashionable theory that the Arabian side had oil, which the geologists of the day flatly denied. He had picked up rights in Bahrain in 1925, and had been circling Kuwait since 1923. Anglo-Persian blocked him every time, using the 1913 undertaking, and a clause in every draft requiring that any concessionaire be a British company. Then the red line closed, and it changed everything by accident. Gulf Oil, the Mellon family company out of Pittsburgh, had joined the American consortium inside the agreement. Bahrain sat inside the red line. That meant Gulf, having bought Holmes's Bahrain option, was now contractually forbidden from developing it alone, and in December 1928, it was forced to sell that option to Standard Oil of California. Gulf had been shut out of the island, so Gulf looked at the map, saw the notch cut out around Kuwait, and went straight for it. Now the reversal, because for 2 years it did not work. The British Foreign Office refused. The nationality clause stood, Gulf was American. And London's position was that the Sheikhdom's oil belonged to a British concessionaire or to nobody. Holmes made offers on Gulf's behalf through 1930 and 1931 and was stonewalled. What broke it was not geology or persuasion. It was Andrew Mellon, who had been Secretary of the Treasury of the United States for 11 years, whose family founded Gulf Oil, and who arrived in London in early 1932 as the American ambassador. On the 9th of April 1932, the embassy formally pressed the Foreign Office on Kuwait, invoking the open door principle, the American doctrine that any nation's companies should have equal commercial access to mandated and protected territories. Britain, which needed Washington's goodwill on war debts more than it needed a monopoly on an unproven sheikhdom, gave way. The nationality clause was dropped that same spring, replaced by a political control clause, guaranteeing Britain a supervisory role. What followed was a 2-year bidding war for the sovereignty of a bankrupt state. Anglo-Persian sent Archibald Chisholm. Gulf sent Holmes. Both men sat in Kuwait through 1932 and 1933, raising their offers. And Sheikh Ahmad al-Jabir al-Sabah played them against each other beautifully, because he had no choice. Kuwait lived on pearling and trade. The Wall Street crash had wrecked the luxury pearl market, and the Japanese cultured pearl had finished it. Ibn Saud had imposed a trade blockade on the town. State revenue had collapsed. The ruler of Kuwait was watching his treasury empty while 2 foreigners competed to hand him money. London ended the auction by ordering a merger. The Kuwait Oil Company was registered in London on the 2nd of February 1934, owned 50-50 by Anglo-Persian and Gulf. Competition had lasted 22 months. The concession was signed on the 23rd of December 1934, 75 years, 475,000 rupees on signature, about 35,000 pounds, 95,000 rupees a year in rent, 3 rupees per ton of oil produced. And the area covered was not a block or a plot. It was the entire state of Kuwait, every square mile of it, on and offshore. Then came the second reversal, and this one nearly ended it. The company's geologists chose Bahra in the north as the first target. Bahra number 1 was drilled through 1936 and into 1937 and came up dry. The company had spent years and a fortune on a country the world's best geologists had said was barren, and the first hole proved them right. They moved south to a low rise of sand in the desert called Burgan, and spudded in on the 30th of October 1937. On the 23rd of February 1938, at 3,672 feet, Burgan No. 1 came in. It came in so violently that they could not control it, and they spent days killing it with weighted mud while oil ran across the sand. They had found the largest sandstone oil field ever discovered on Earth. Something in the order of 70 billion barrels of oil in place, under a territory smaller than Wales, held on a 75-year contract signed 38 months earlier by a ruler whose customs revenue had just collapsed. The war interrupted it. In 1942, with the Axis in North Africa, the wells were plugged with concrete in case Kuwait fell. Exports finally began on the 30th of June 1946, when Sheikh Ahmad turned a silver valve to start the flow into the first tanker. So here's who ended up holding what. In Iraq, the Turkish Petroleum Company renamed itself the Iraq Petroleum Company in 1929. Its final shareholding after Ostend was Anglo-Persian 23.75%, Royal Dutch Shell 23.75%, the French company 23.75%, the American group 23.75%, and Calouste Gulbenkian 5%. In 1931, a revised convention gave the company exclusive rights over 32,000 square miles east of the Tigris, an area slightly larger than Ireland, in exchange for a guaranteed minimum payment of 400,000 gold pounds a year. Then, a sister company took the territory west of the Tigris in 1932. Then, the Basra Petroleum Company took the south in 1938. By the end of that year, the same 5 shareholders held drilling rights over essentially all of Iraq's 169,000 square miles, running to the year 2000. Iraq's payment stayed at 4 gold shillings a ton. In Kuwait, Anglo-Persian and Gulf held 50% each, and Kuwait received 3 rupees a ton, roughly 4.5 shillings, on the largest single accumulation of oil in the world, and the pattern is clearest of all in the parent company. In 1950, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company paid the British Treasury more in United Kingdom taxation than it paid Iran in royalties for owning the oil. The government, that owned 51% of the company, collected more from the arrangement than the government that owned the oil field. Gulbenkian's 5%, negotiated before the First World War, paid out until Iraq nationalized the company in 1972. He died in Lisbon in 1955, having never held an operating job in the industry, leaving an estate estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars, which today funds one of Europe's largest cultural foundations. Now the timing, which indicts everyone in the room. Iraq signed away its oil on the 14th of March 1925, and received Mosul from the League of Nations 277 days later. Turkey took 500,000 pounds in 1926, and Baba Gurgur blew in 16 months after that. And the concession that Faisal signed under duress in the year he was too ill to fight it was still in force, still paying 4 gold shillings a ton when he had been dead for 39 years. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is a topic where conspiracy theories flourish and careless claims distort reality. The crude version of this story says that Britain invented Kuwait out of nothing, cutting it from Iraq's Basra province, in order to deny Baghdad a coastline and hand the oil to Anglo-American companies. That version is false, and you should reject it. Kuwait was not invented in 1922 or 1913. The Al Sabah have ruled it since around 1752. Britain signed a protection agreement with Sheikh Mubarak in January 1899, when no oil had been found anywhere in Arabia. The Anglo-Ottoman Convention of the 29th of July, 1913, recognized Kuwait as an autonomous district with defined limits, and it did so before a single barrel had been produced anywhere on the Arabian side of the Gulf. When Percy Cox drew his line at Uqair, he was arbitrating a violent dispute over tribal grazing and raiding between Najd, Iraq, and Kuwait. Nobody at Uqair knew Burgan existed. The geological consensus at that moment was that Arabia had no oil at all. I will concede more than that. The famous scene of Gulbenkian drawing the red line with a pencil at Ostend is thinly sourced and treated with caution by serious historians, and there is no declassified document in which an official writes that Kuwait must be excluded from the agreement so that Gulf oil can take it. The exclusion is explained in the record by the 1913 undertaking and by American pressure for equal access. What the archives do establish is worse than the myth and completely verifiable. The concession texts exist. The Uqair Protocol exists. Harold Dixon, who was standing there, published his account of the red pencil in 1956. The Red Line Agreement itself, with its map, was printed in full by the United States Federal Trade Commission in its 1952 report to the Senate titled The International Petroleum Cartel. The India Office records on Kuwait sit in the British Library. The Colonial and Foreign Office files sit at Kew, and historians including Marion Kent, Helmut Maker, and Peter Sluglet have worked through them for decades. What they show is not a secret cabal. It is a cartel that legally agreed in writing not to compete across an entire region, and 2 governments that treated other people's sovereignty as a negotiable asset on their own balance sheets. And this is where the story takes a turn that explains everything that followed. In 1938, King Ghazi of Iraq, Faisal's son, began broadcasting from a radio transmitter in his palace, demanding that Kuwait be returned to Iraq. He died in a car crash the following year. On the 19th of June, 1961, Britain formally ended its protectorate and Kuwait became independent. 6 days later, on the 25th of June, Iraq's leader Abdul Karim Qasim declared Kuwait an integral part of Basra province. Britain landed troops on the 1st of July under Operation Vantage. Then Qasim did the other thing. In December 1961, he passed Law No. 80, which stripped the Iraq Petroleum Company of 99.5% of its concession area, leaving it only the fields it was actually producing from. He had cancelled the 1925 settlement. 14 months later, on the 8th of February 1963, he was overthrown and shot. The new government in Baghdad recognized Kuwait's independence on the 4th of October 1963. Kuwait extended Iraq an interest-free loan of 30 million Kuwaiti dinars. The border was, once again, settled with a payment. Iraq nationalized the company outright in 1972. Then it borrowed enormously to fight Iran from 1980 to 1988, and by the end of that war, it owed Kuwait somewhere around $14 billion out of a total foreign debt near $80 billion. In 1990, Baghdad demanded the debt be forgiven, accused Kuwait of drilling sideways into the Rumaila field that straddles the line Cox drew, and invaded on the 2nd of August. After the war, United Nations Security Council Resolution 833 in May 1993 demarcated the boundary and shifted it slightly northward, moving part of Rumaila and several docks at Qasr onto the Kuwaiti side. Iraq today has about 58 kilometers of coastline. Kuwait has nearly 500. And in September 2023, Iraq's Federal Supreme Court ruled the country's navigation agreement with Kuwait over the Khor Abdullah waterway unconstitutional, reopening a maritime dispute that has been running continuously since 1922 and which still governs how Iraqi oil reaches the sea. The consequences have never stopped compounding. They have simply changed currency. Remember the debt, £7.4 billion and a navy that ran on something Britain did not have. Remember the pencil. One at Uqair in December 1922, one at Ostend in July 1928, both red, both drawn by men who would never live in the countries they were cutting. Remember the timeline. 277 days between the signature that gave away Iraq's oil and the ruling that gave Iraq its northern province, and not one document that admits the two were connected, because none was ever needed. Remember the price? £500,000 for Turkey's share of Kirkuk, 4 gold shillings a ton for Iraq, 3 rupees a ton for the largest oil field on earth. Borders are usually described as the residue of history, the scars left by armies. But armies are expensive, and empires that are deep in debt do not fight for what they can instead sign for. What if the map of the modern Middle East is better understood not as a record of conquest, but as a schedule of payments? And if a line drawn in a tent in 1922 was still deciding, 101 years later, whether Iraqi crude could reach open water, then who exactly is still being charged? And when does the account close? If you found this useful, subscribe to the channel, because this is the kind of history we go deep on every week, and hit the like button, since it genuinely does decide whether anyone else ever sees it. And I want to hear from you in the comments on one thing. Given that the 1913 undertaking, not the 1922 border, is what really put Kuwait beyond Iraq's reach, do you think any Iraqi government could ever have undone it? Tell me below.